Kristen, and you're listening to Podcast and Amplify, a podcast for women entrepreneurs who want to amplify their voice and brand through podcasting and grow a wildly successful business. I'm the executive producer and host of 2 shows and an entrepreneur, and I love helping women grow their visibility, mindset, and business to the next level. Each week, I share tips on how to launch and leverage your podcast, and I'm bringing on the very best business leaders to give you advice on how to build your business empire. Let's amplify your voice and business. Hey listeners, welcome back to the show. I am so excited about this week's episode. So we are talking all about how to cultivate creativity as a podcaster, because creating a podcast, it's a creative endeavor. And I wanted to give you some tips on how to tap into your creative juices, because I know sometimes we can get a little bit stuck and not always have a ton of ideas at the ready or top of mind. So I wanted to give you just a few ways to cultivate creativity. Okay, so first, let's talk about the fact that we are all creative beings. So even if you think that you're not creative, we are all creative. And that could look like, I think most people think that means you're artistic, you can draw or paint or dance or write, but creativity comes in all forms. Creativity is also problem solving. I mean, you have to be really creative to solve problems and sometimes think outside the box to solve problems, which is very creative. Sometimes creativity can look like strategy, being really good at coming up with strategic solutions requires creativity. So there are a lot of ways that creativity can manifest, and everyone has some level of creativity, especially entrepreneurs, because we have to be creative in so many different ways. A lot of the time we wear a lot of different hats. A lot of the time we are multi-passionate. So entrepreneurs tend to be naturally creative in a lot of different ways. Okay, so the first thing we want to do to set ourselves up for tapping into our creativity is to set aside some time to be creative, to create just for the sake of creating. And that could look like painting, playing a game. For me, I do a coloring book. I have a mindfulness coloring book, and I just sit there. There are patterns, and you would think, oh, she's just coloring in between the lines. Well, there's so many patterns that it helps my brain think about, how am I going to use the colors in a creative way? How am I going to create my own patterns with the colors that I'm using? And I just let my mind flow. And from page to page, or even image to image within the same page, I just let my mind think of different ways to make slight adjustments or make big adjustments. So it's just a purely creative endeavor. I've also signed up for online art sessions, which have been really fun. There are so many ways to be creative, but it's really important to set aside the time to be inspired. So that's number one. Number two, I don't know about you, but most of us don't feel inspired when we aren't in inspiring places. So I imagine that most of us don't feel inspired when we're in, say, the DMV office, waiting in the line, sitting under those harsh fluorescent lights. That's not a very creativity inducing environment. But when we're sitting in a playfully decorated room or a space that has a lot of light or makes us feel energized or cozy or whatever it is for you, that's something that you can think about is, what types of spaces make you feel inspired. It might be just being in nature, or it might be a really well decorated room. Whatever that is, create, try and create that environment to match your creative self. And that's going to make it that much easier for you to get inspired and to tap into your creativity. Okay, so the third thing that you absolutely must do when it comes to your creativity. Are you ready? Okay. It's to capture your creative ideas. Now, this has been a real game changer for me. I am a creative person, and I used to get pops of inspiration, usually when I'm walking my dog. And they would come to me, and I would say, "Oh, I'll write that down when I get back to my desk at home." And then I would forget them, and I would have maybe two or three ideas on one like half-hour walk, and I would forget. It was like a little blip of inspiration, and then it would just flutter away from my mind and I couldn't get it back. And I was so frustrated by that. But it made sense after I read Elizabeth Gilbert's book, Big Magic, on creativity. And it's a great book as a whole. I will link it into the show notes. I recommend this book to anyone who is a creative or wants to be more creative. It's fantastic. But she views creative ideas as being like downloads, and that the ideas are given to you, but they're not given to you forever. They're given to you, and if you don't do anything with them, then they will go to someone else who will. It's kind of an interesting way of looking at creativity. I liked it because I'd never thought of creativity like that before. But that led to what became one of the biggest changes for me. It was recognizing that when I had inspiration, I needed to write it down. And it really pains me to think about like all of those ideas that I lost simply because I didn't write it down. Hey friends, we'll get back to the show in just a moment, but I wanted to take just a few seconds to invite you to a free workshop that I created. It's called Launch a Binge-Worthy Podcast, and it's all about helping you to create a heartfelt podcast that reaches your soul listeners and grows your business. If you want access, just go to podcastandamplify.com. It's totally free. Okay, friend, back to the show. It's also a way to learn to not take your creativity for granted. Our creativity, our ideas, they're really special. And if we have them, we should honor them and value them and nurture them and really give it that attention that it deserves, giving it that respect that it deserves, and just doing that one step of I have the idea, I'm going to grab onto it and put it somewhere safe. So, what I do, because I am usually walking my dog, like I said, I'm usually on the go when these ideas occur to me. I use my notes app on my phone. So, when the idea comes in, and for me, it kind of feels like a short inhale. It's almost like because I'm creative, I'm kind of visual. It's almost like it feels like it flutters down into my brain. And then there's kind of this little intake. And then I know to write it down. So I use the apps feature in on my phone. I use Evernote, which I'm pretty pleased with because I have the free version. So with the free version, your notes will sync between two devices. So I can put my note into my phone, and then I can go onto my laptop when I'm ready to, say, write my script for this podcast episode or write a post for social media. And I can go on my laptop and access it as well. So that's why I use this note taking tool. And I'll link to this in the show notes as well. Okay, so we also want to pay attention to when our creativity happens and also how it feels. So there may be times during the day that you get sort of your downloads of creativity more than others. For me, it could happen really at any point of the day, but some people like to get up first thing in the morning and sort of write about their dreams before they start anything because that's a really creative time for them. Some people, it might be later in the evening before they go to bed, but tapping into when is that creativity flowing for you is really important because then you can prepare and set things up to be able to capture and maximize that creativity. You also want to think about how does it feel when you're sort of receiving that creative download. Feels like for me, it's sort of like this little intake of breath. It's not always audible, but I can just kind of feel it in my chest. My chest just kind of like rises. And I think, oh, I have to write this down. And so, because I pay attention to how that feels, I know it typically happens when I'm walking my dog. I'm kind of like prepared for it to happen. And so I know to like bring my phone with me because that's where I'm going to record my inspiration, and also helps me to be sort of more open to the creativity, the creative spark, and the download, whatever you want to call it, because I'm looking for it. I feel like it makes it less likely that I'll miss it, that I'll miss the creative inspiration. So that's another way to cultivate your creativity. So we talked about carving out time for creativity to sort of build up that muscle and get those juices flowing. We talked about how important it is to feel inspired by your environment, figuring out what that looks like for you. We talked about paying attention to when you're at your most creative and also to how that feels in your body, be able to recognize that. And then finally, we talked about how to not take our creativity for granted and to give it the attention that it deserves. So I hope what I talked about gives you just some tools to think about your creativity, how to foster it, how to encourage it, and how to see yourself as the creative being that you are. And this is going to help you come up with the most amazing podcast episodes and content for your business because you're able to really harness that inspiration, that creativity. So that's what I've got for you today. I hope this was helpful. If you know of anyone who is maybe struggling with their creativity and how to nurture it, go ahead and share this episode with them. And if you found this episode helpful as well, make sure to leave a review. It's the best way to help this podcast grow. And I super appreciate it. I do read every review. And if you're thinking about starting a podcast and you want some one-on-one help with that, I invite you to join my Overwhelmed to Aligned intensive. It's a creative, collaborative space. It's what I love doing, creative collaboration. Oh, it's so much fun. It's my wheelhouse, and I will help you get really clear on your amazing podcast, build that foundation so that everything else in your podcast feels really easy, feels really aligned, and you attract the kind of soul listeners that you want to connect with. So I am linking that in the show notes. If you have any questions, please reach out to me on Instagram, and I look forward to catching you inside the next episode. Thanks for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe so you don't miss a show. And rating and reviewing this podcast is the best way to help support us. Always remember, your voice and what you have to offer is needed in the world. Until next week, take care.